Have you ever wondered why you can remember a memory from 10 years ago so clearly, but completely forget the content of a meeting after only a few hours? Welcome to the world of long-term memory. In today's video, we'll explore rule number 6 in our series of 12 laws of the brain. Remember to recall. This rule helps us understand how the brain transforms fragile pieces of information into lasting memories, and why rote memorization, seemingly diligent, is the enemy of wisdom. To understand this, we need to start with how the brain decides what deserves to be remembered long-term. We'll now move on to the first part of rule number 6. Part 1. The brain isn't neutral. It's always selective of information. Before we get to this part, I have a question for everyone. If the brain always prioritizes information related to itself, how would this affect how we learn and absorb knowledge every day? Let's get back to the main point. We often believe that when exposed to information, the brain processes it objectively and fairly. But the truth is, the brain always acts like a strict gatekeeper. Every second, millions of signals enter our senses, and the brain has to ask itself, is this information worth keeping? During evolution, the brain learned that what directly relates to oneself, safety, emotions, social status, and personal goals, is generally of higher survival value. Therefore, it is prioritized for processing and storage. Brainstem studies show that when people think about themselves, the medial prefrontal cortex is highly active. Notably, this brain region is directly connected to the long-term memory system. In other words, the self is a gateway to memory. Based on this, you now have the answer to the question. If the brain always prioritizes information related to itself, how would this affect how we learn and absorb knowledge every day? The answer is, this shows that passive learning, just listening, just reading, just taking notes, goes against how the brain functions. To learn effectively, we must actively immerse ourselves in that knowledge. When the brain realizes, this is my business, the entire way it processes information will change. And what kind of change is that? We'll now move on to part 2, the self-association effect, the scientific mechanism behind long-term memory. Before we get to this section, I have a question for everyone. Why does the brain invest so much memory resources in information that is personal to it? Let's get back to the main point. In cognitive psychology, the phenomenon of people remembering information related to themselves better is called the self-reference effect. This is not a subjective feeling, but an effect that has been verified by experiments. In a classic study, participants were asked to learn adjectives in 3 ways: evaluating word structure, evaluating general meaning, evaluating whether the word describes themselves. The results showed that the group that associated the word with themselves had the highest retention rate, significantly better than the other 2 groups. In this case, the brain not only processes information, but also integrates it into a pre-existing network of memories about who I am. This creates multiple anchor points, making memory retrieval easier. Based on this, you now have the answer to the question, why does the brain invest so much memory resources in information that is personal to it? The answer is because this information has helped humans make quick and accurate decisions in survival situations. The brain learns that what is related to me is usually important. Therefore, when information is associated with me, the brain understands that it deserves priority. But there's still a more important question. What makes the brain not only prioritize, but also deeply engrave a memory? The answer lies not in reason, but in emotion. Because in the human brain, there is no personal connection stronger than emotion. We'll now move on to part 3, emotions, the biological glue that binds memories together. Before we get to this part, I have a question for everyone. What happens to learning if there is absolutely no emotion? Let's get back to the main point. Emotions act as a biological marker for memory. When an experience is accompanied by strong emotions, the limbic system, especially the amygdala, sends signals to the brain that this information is important, It needs to be recorded. That's why we remember so clearly the first time we got a bad grade, the time we stumbled over a word in front of a crowd, or the moment we achieved a great accomplishment. These memories not only contain content, but also the accompanying emotional state. When learning is linked to personal emotions, it is no longer abstract data, but becomes a lived experience. Based on that, you now have the answer to the question. So what happens to learning if there is absolutely no emotion? The answer is, when there is no emotion, the brain doesn't have priority signals. Memories become faded, fragmented, and easily forgotten, making learning ineffective. But this also gives us an important advantage. If emotions can make memories stand out, then we can also proactively create emotions to make memories deeper. And once we understand this mechanism, we don't need to learn more, but we need to learn differently. We will continue to part 4, turning dry knowledge into your own story. Before we get to this part, I have a question for everyone. How do you apply this principle to abstract or data-heavy subjects? Let's get back to the main point. Instead of asking, "What does this concept say?" ask, "How has it appeared in my life?" Any knowledge can be linked to a real-life situation, a wrong decision, a failure, a moment of confusion. When you recount the knowledge as a story in which you are the main character, your brain will automatically reorganize the information into a more memorable structure. Based on that, you already have the answer to the question, so how do you apply this principle to abstract or data-heavy subjects? Connect each concept to a personal experience, however small. A number can be associated with a mistake. A formula can be associated with a time you applied it correctly or incorrectly. When each concept is linked to a personal experience, knowledge no longer remains on paper, but begins to live in your memory. But for this to go beyond mere understanding, we need to turn it into a daily learning habit. Because Rule 6 is not just about understanding, but about applying. We will now move to the final part of Rule 6, the practical toolkit, learning with yourself at your center. Whenever you learn something new, pause for a moment and actively immerse yourself in that knowledge through 3 simple yet incredibly powerful steps. Step 1. Name the experience. Ask yourself, where have I encountered this before in my life? It could be a very small situation, a single mistake, a hasty decision, an experience that confused or surprised you. The brain doesn't need a perfect experience, it just needs a familiar anchor point. Step 2. Attach the emotion. Next, identify the emotion you felt when the experience occurred. Anxiety, disappointment, excitement, or pride. This emotion will act as a marker, telling the brain that this information is worth remembering. Step 3. Rephrase. Finally, retell that knowledge in your own words, as if you were telling a story to someone else. When you can articulate it in your own words, the brain understands that you not only received, but mastered the information. So, if we consistently apply these 3 steps, what will change? Learning becomes more active, profound, and sustainable. Knowledge no longer remains on paper, but has become part of personal experience. Rule number 6 gives us an important truth. The brain doesn't memorize information, it memorizes meaning, especially meaning that relates to you. If you want to remember things better, don't learn like a bystander. Put yourself at the center of that knowledge. Thank you for watching the video to the end. If you found this content helpful, please share it with those who are studying and doing intellectual work. and see you again in the next rule of the 12 Rules of the Brain series. Goodbye.